Imagine standing on the deck of a small island nation at the turn of the 20th century, watching great powers steam by with coal smoke trailing into the sky. That island is Japan, and around 1900, it's moving fast, not just catching up, but sprinting. After the shock of defeating Russia in 1905, Japan discovered something profound. It could stand toe-to-toe with Western empires. That victory wasn't just military pride. It was a signal to the world that a non-Western nation could modernize, industrialize, and rewrite expectations. You can almost smell the change. New factories springing up, smokestacks, iron rails, and a military being shaped into a force to be reckoned with. Cities are humming, and the government funnels energy into education, industry, and a modern navy. But amid that energy, there's a raw, practical problem that never seems to go away. Japan simply lacks the natural resources to fuel its ambitions. Unlike the United States or the big European empires, Japan has very little oil, limited iron ore, and few other raw materials. As an island nation with a dense population and growing industries, that scarcity feels like an existential threat. That scarcity pushes Japan toward a hard conclusion. Survival depends on expansion. Territory looks like security. Resources look like lifelines. In 1931, the first major step in that direction comes with the invasion of Manchuria. It's swift, decisive, and results in a puppet state where Japan can exert control over raw materials and strategic depth. 4 years later, in 1937, Japan launches a much broader assault, the Second Sino-Japanese War, a full-scale invasion of China. From Tokyo's perspective, these moves are framed as practical: secure resources, create room for an expanding population, and assert Japan's rightful place in Asia. From the outside world's view, they read as aggressive expansion and a destabilizing force in the region. Now step into the offices and halls of Japan's leadership in the late 1930s. There's rhetoric that's seductive and urgent, the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. It's marketed as a noble, almost romantic idea: Asia for Asians, a bloc free from Western exploitation. Leaders pitch it as liberation from old colonial chains. For many Japanese, it's a narrative of moral leadership, cultural affinity, and economic self-sufficiency. The language is stirring, but the reality on the ground is far less flattering. In truth, occupied territories quickly find that co-prosperity is mostly a slogan. Military governors run daily life with an iron hand. Local economies are reorganized to serve Japan's needs. Resources are extracted, production is repurposed, and resistance is met with repression. The rhetoric masks a brutal calculus: secure raw materials, create strategic buffer zones, and build an empire that can rival Western colonial systems. This expansion sets Japan on a direct collision course with Western interests. Britain, France, the Netherlands all have colonies in Asia. Japan's vision is implicitly antagonistic to their presence. And then there's the United States, a Pacific power with economic and strategic stakes in Asia. The co-prosperity sphere reads as both a challenge and a threat to American access and influence. Tensions ratchet up as Japan's ambitions grow clearer. By 1940, the most pressing vulnerability becomes painfully obvious. Japan depends on oil, and a lot of it comes from the United States. Think of oil not just as fuel for cars, but as the lifeblood of a modern navy and air force. Without steady access to petroleum, Japan's expansion could stall. So when Japan moves into French Indochina, a strategic push to consolidate control in Southeast Asia, the United States reacts with economic pressure. Sanctions begin to bite. In 1941, the US freezes Japanese assets and cuts off oil exports. For Japan's leaders, this is catastrophic in practical terms and humiliating in political terms. Japan can imagine two stark choices: pull back from China and abandon the expansionist policy that seems crucial for survival, or push farther south to seize oil-rich territories in Southeast Asia. The latter means targeting the Dutch East Indies and British-controlled regions that are flush with the resources Japan lacks. But there's a huge complication. The US Pacific Fleet sits at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, a massive modern force that could intervene if Japan tries to expand south. Japanese strategists face a dilemma that's both military and political. If they strike and provoke the United States, they risk a drawn-out war with an industrial giant. If they don't act, their oil supplies run out and their strategic position collapses. It's a gamble that feels like a forced hand: act quickly and decisively, or surrender Japan's hopes for a new order. So Japan decides to strike first, On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the world witnesses a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Aircraft streak across the Hawaiian sky, bombs fall, and the US Pacific Fleet is badly damaged. The immediate objective is straightforward: cripple the US fleet long enough for Japan to move into Southeast Asia and secure the resources it desperately needs. From Japan's planners' point of view, the attack is a calculated risk. They hope the blow will be so severe and shocking that the United States will opt for negotiation rather than a protracted war across the vast Pacific. They assume American public opinion might not have the stomach for a long conflict, that damage plus diplomacy could buy Japan time and space. Instead, what they unleash is the opposite. The attack hardens American resolve. Public outrage becomes overwhelming. The next day, the United States declares war. The nation that wakes up furious is also a nation with enormous industrial capacity, and that capacity soon becomes the decisive factor. In the months that follow Pearl Harbor, Japan moves with staggering speed. Its forces sweep through Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. The Philippines fall, and American and Filipino defenders are pushed back. British strongholds, places like Malaya and Singapore, are overrun. The fall of Singapore is especially stunning. British forces surrender in what is remembered as one of the largest defeats in British military history. The Dutch East Indies, with its oil, becomes one of Japan's prizes. For a time, Japan seems unstoppable. The empire expands to its greatest size, stretching across thousands of miles of ocean and land. The strategy appears to be working. Japan secures vital resources, builds defensive perimeter lines, and consolidates control. In Tokyo, confidence swells. Yet beneath the surface, structural problems are growing. The initial conquests give Japan territory, but not the industrial base needed to sustain a long war against the United States and its allies. Japan has the resources, oil, rubber, metals, but turning those materials into tanks, ships, and planes in the quantities needed is a different matter altogether. Everything changes in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway. It's a clash of carrier fleets that happens largely out of sight over the vast Pacific, and it becomes one of the most consequential naval battles in history. Japan loses 4 of its fleet carriers, priceless assets, and with them go many of the naval pilots who are hard to replace. The momentum shifts. The United States, which has been rushing shipyards, training pilots, and mobilizing industry, begins to take the strategic initiative. The American response is methodical, a strategy called island hopping. Instead of grinding through every Japanese-held island, US forces focus on capturing key positions that provide airfields and naval bases, cutting Japanese supply lines and isolating strongholds. As the Americans push westward, Japan is forced into a defensive posture. Supply lines stretch thin, raw materials are increasingly scarce. American industrial capacity, the ability to build carriers, destroyers, aircraft and tanks at scale, outpaces Japan's ability to replace losses. Add to this the growing effectiveness of American bombing campaigns. Strategic bombing begins to hit Japanese cities and factories, eroding industrial output and morale. Blockades and submarine warfare choke off the flow of resources. Japan's initial advantages, speed, surprise, and large territorial gains, are gradually overwhelmed by an opponent that can absorb losses and rebuild on a massive scale. By 1945, the strain on Japan is undeniable. Resources are nearly exhausted, cities have been bombed, and transportation networks disrupted. The home front faces shortages and mounting civilian casualties. The United States, meanwhile, has refined a new and terrible technology, the atomic bomb. In August 1945, 2 of these weapons are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing destruction on an unprecedented scale. The human cost is immense. Tens of thousands killed instantly, countless more suffering long-term injuries and radiation effects. At the same time, the Soviet Union enters the war against Japan, launching a large-scale invasion of Japanese-held territories in Manchuria. Faced with the combined horrors of atomic destruction, Soviet offensives and total military collapse, Japan's leadership confronts an unbearable choice. Emperor Hirohito makes a historic decision. On August 15, 1945, he addresses the nation by radio, the first time the emperor speaks directly to the people, and announces Japan's surrender. That surrender marks the end of an empire. It's a moment of shock, relief, humiliation, and mourning all at once. Militarily and politically, Japan's aggressive expansion comes to a decisive halt. The war that began as a bid for resources and regional dominance ends in defeat and occupation. Now take a step back and look at the whole arc. From Japan's perspective, the war was driven by an urgent fear of economic strangulation. Without oil and raw materials, Japan saw itself as vulnerable, forced into a posture of expansion for survival. There was also an ambition to lead Asia, to create a self-sufficient bloc free of Western domination. Nationalism and a belief in Japan's unique role in the region fused with practical needs to form a powerful engine. But there was a critical miscalculation. Japan underestimated the industrial might and political will of the United States. The strategy that relied on quick, decisive victories couldn't account for an enemy that could replace losses by the thousands and move entire wartime economies into production. The war stretched Japan beyond its limits, and the result was devastation. Millions of lives lost across Asia, cities in ruins, and an empire dissolved. Yet the story doesn't end with ruin. In the decades after the war, Japan rebuilds in a way that surprises many. Under occupation and then in peacetime, it undergoes massive political, economic, and social changes. Investments in education, technology, and infrastructure, combined with a global trading environment, helped Japan transform into one of the world's largest economies. The military ambitions of the wartime era give way to a pacifist constitution and a focus on economic growth. When you put the pieces together, Japan's journey through the first half of the 20th century looks like a study in ambition, fear, and consequence. A nation that modernized rapidly and proved itself on the battlefield believed expansion was necessary to survive. It crafted an ideological case for leadership in Asia, but its methods brought suffering and resistance. International tensions over resources escalated into confrontation, and the decision to strike first at Pearl Harbor pulled the United States into a duel. It was uniquely equipped to win. There's a human layer to this narrative as well. Behind the geopolitical language are choices made by leaders under pressure, by soldiers following orders, and by civilians caught in the crossfire. Millions paid in blood and suffering. Cities were destroyed, families never fully recovered, yet history also records resilience, the ability of people and nations to rebuild, to learn, and to forge new paths after catastrophe. So what do you take away from this? Maybe it's that fear can drive nations to desperate choices, that rhetoric like co-prosperity can mask exploitation, and that industrial capacity, how quickly a society can turn resources into tools of war, often decides modern conflicts. Or maybe the lesson is more personal, that the ambitions of leaders have real consequences for ordinary lives, and that the costs of miscalculation are often paid by those least able to influence the decisions. Either way, the story of Japan's rise and fall in World War II is complex and layered. It's a tale of modernization and military daring, of ideological conviction and crushing reality. It's also a reminder that history rarely follows a single clean narrative. Instead, it's messy, full of trade-offs, mistakes, and unexpected turns, and it leaves lessons that still matter today. As you reflect on this episode of history, notice how closely practical needs and grand ideas were intertwined. Sometimes empires expand because of ideology, sometimes because of necessity, and sometimes because leaders mix the two until they blur. The tragedy of Japan's wartime path lies in that mixture, ambition masked as survival, and survival pursued through conquest. The aftermath, deep loss, then recovery, shows both the cost and the human capacity to remake a future from the ruins of the past. End with this image, a map of the Pacific in 1941, coloured by the ambitions of nations and the flow of resources. Now overlay that map with the voices of ordinary people, workers, parents, soldiers, shopkeepers, all swept along by decisions far above them. That juxtaposition captures the heart of the story. Grand strategy meets everyday life, and the results are profound, tragic, and ultimately transformative.